Welcome to CosmoFactory, a podcast by Cosmoprof Worldwide Bologna, where we explore the entire cosmetics, personal care, and fragrance industry supply chain. I'm your host, Deanna Utrusky, and here at CosmoFactory, we look beyond the trends to discover the ideas, initiatives, and innovations that are truly advancing beauty. Let's get started. This episode is about genomic research and molecular testing. It's about protein expression, gene expression, and what this data can tell us about ingredients as well as finished products. It's about in vitro, ex vivo, and clinical findings. And it's about the strategic priorities and market trends that the business of testing reflects back to us. Today's CosmoFactory podcast guest is Jocelyn Kearsley, Senior Technical Sales Manager at Genemarkers. Jocelyn, welcome to CosmoFactory.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. So over the past 50 years, or maybe even a little longer, we've seen scientific discoveries and technological progress overlap to make gene expression research possible at an impressive scale. I'm thinking of breakthrough platform technologies like high-throughput DNA sequencing, RNA sequencing, microarray technology. This list goes on and on. But as for the cosmetic and personal care industry, in December 2003, L'Oreal published an article in the peer-reviewed Journal of Investigative Dermatology. That 2003 article is called Modulation of Gene Expression Induced in Human Epidermis by Environmental Stress in Vivo. Maybe not the most glamorous title, but important research, absolutely. Then in 2006, we saw Shiseido conducting research on 30,000 genes in both sun-protected and sun-exposed skin. In 2008, Genemarkers, the company where you work, Jocelyn, was founded by Anna Langerfeld. Then, in 2010, P&G filed for that beauty maker's first patent using genetic biomarker-based methods to understand skincare ingredient and product efficacy. I share all these moments in time to point out that while gene expression science is going to be very familiar to some of our listeners, and the technology can today rightly be called commonplace in cosmetics and personal care, in the biopharma industry, in medicine, food science, agriculture, but it's still a relatively new technology. And I also want to note that when Genemarkers launched, the company was very much a pioneer in this field. And I would argue, too, that the beauty industry itself is a pioneer in biomarker research. Of course, we do want to hear from an expert. So, Jocelyn, get us started by helping explain at the most basic level, what is gene expression?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent place to start. I think, there's folks in the industry that have a lot of experience with this stuff, and there's also brands that are new to it and realizing that it's going to be beneficial to have this, in their process. So it's important to understand what it is. And essentially, it refers to which pieces of DNA are being turned on or off in a certain cell type under certain conditions. So, back to basic biology, all of our cells have the same DNA. And what makes them behave differently is the combination of the genes that are turned on or off within that DNA and when those transcription of being turned on and off is taking place. So if you take it back to biology, again, the DNA is technically the code that is transcribed into a messenger called RNA. And then that RNA is translated into a protein, which is the molecules that are doing the work in the cell. Mm-hmm. And like you mentioned, there's a lot of technologies meant to measure that RNA and the proteins in a very high throughput and efficient manner, which is what we're doing in the cosmetic industry today.
Yeah. So just so I understand clearly, when we have gene expression, or in some cases, as you've mentioned, protein expression, we call these biomarkers because the expression is a way to measure a biological process. Does that sound right?
Correct. Yes, that's ultimately the goal of performing these gene or protein expression tests, is to find biomarkers that prove that your ingredient or your formulation are effective for what you think they're being effective for.
Yeah. And so this type of testing is novel insofar as you can analyze how that ingredient or finished product formulation works at the molecular level. I think more classical testing methods have been functional, right? They document what happens, or maybe something that doesn't happen to the hair or to the skin. Is that also true? Can you say a little bit about that sort of molecular level analysis?
Yeah, I think the molecular level analysis, essentially what we're seeing raw data points that are produced from exposing a cell or a tissue to a treatment. And then, we use advanced technologies to process those data points. And then we use calculations to calculate the fold change or the percent change in values after those tissues or cells are exposed to a treatment. And after analyzing that data, we're able to tell you for each of those specific genes or proteins, how much has it been increased or decreased relative to a control sample or an industry standard that somebody is trying to emulate in their formulation or ingredient.
Okay. Okay. So like if we see this in terms of a biological process, it means something else in terms of a mechanism of action or in terms of efficacy. And I'm guessing it's not always sort of straightforward. Um, More gene expression doesn't mean more efficacy.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it, right? I think it's important to look at what is changing by how much and why it matters, which is why it's important to understand each of the gene functions and the cascades, because sometimes, an increase of expression isn't necessarily a good thing, right? If you're seeing increases in biomarkers for things such as inflammation, it can be interpreted as, hey, maybe this is, irritating the skin, or sometimes it can be positive. In the case of retinol, right? We're seeing increased inflammation, which is recruiting some of those helpful molecules in the skin that help with repair. So it's important to understand the gene expression changes in the context that you think your product is working, or historical data that prompted you to want to explore, those pathways a bit further.
Mhm. And it's really useful to hear you use inflammation as an example. Can you share some other examples of those sorts of outcomes that we might be looking at with this sort of testing?
Yeah, in respect to inflammation, I think there's a lot of different pathways and biological processes that are involved in the inflammation response. And yeah, we can look at several different biomarkers that are involved in that. And a lot of the times we'll, perform in-house testing to try to find the baseline level of inflammation that occurs um, in response to different exposures. I think a good example is there's inflammation that happens in response to UV exposure. So we're able to calculate what that is, and then um, test like a compound or an ingredient to see if that's able to reduce the damage or prevent the damage that would be caused that way.
Mhm, mhm. No, that makes sense. So we know gene expression technology can be used for both preclinical and clinical testing because we have some listeners working in other areas. I do want to quickly mention some of the testing basic terms here. Preclinical testing does not involve consumer participants. It happens either in vitro, so outside of a living being. This is often a petri dish or a test tube, or ex vivo. And this method involves viable tissue or cells that are, in my words, no longer attached to a human or an animal, but they once were. And then clinical testing does involve people who serve as study participants. With those notes out of the way, Jocelyn, help us think about the preclinical and clinical applications for gene expression testing.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. This molecular testing can be useful in early stages, such as those preclinical phases, for ensuring that ingredients or blends aren't causing any toxic effects. It's really important to screen the activity of raw materials both alone and in combinations with one another to find safe and effective doses, different ratios. Sometimes it can be used to evaluate different delivery systems, and overall just ensuring that the product or ingredient is behaving the way that you anticipate it's behaving.
And those were all preclinical examples.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, all preclinical examples. And then the preclinical testing, everything that you learn from doing those tests can be used to help research teams prioritize which compounds would be worth moving to a clinical study. If you're seeing promising efficacy in one formulation in an in vitro test or preclinical test, then you can, elucidate that it might perform well in human studies as well. So, yeah, when it comes to clinical testing, the same kinds of molecular analysis can be performed on samples coming from humans, such as tissue biopsies, tape strips, skin swabs, hair follicles, all the way down to blood as well for nutritional supplements.
Mhm, mhm. Okay. And in one of our earlier conversations, you explained to me that testing design itself is often a collaborative process. Can you sort of walk me through how testing companies and their clients actually invent a particular test?
Yeah, I think ultimately we need to come up with a scientifically sound plan that meets their project goals, their budget, and their timeline. So sometimes we already have tests that are developed to evaluate something. We'll often meet with the teams, find out what their objectives and timelines are. What kinds of models are they interested in? So if it's something that already exists and is proven to be able to evaluate test materials in that assay, then we can, perform that pretty straightforward. But we're seeing a lot of industry folks these days interested in developing new models. I think there's a lot of new indications on the market, and new areas of functionality that folks are pursuing that necessarily don't have great testing models yet. So we're seeing a lot of the innovation being driven by folks wanting to explore new biological processes and ways to measure the impacts on those.
Mhm, mhm. So it sounds like in some cases there are sort of maybe not standardized, but conventional tests. But maybe it's true more often than not that a molecular testing company isn't developing a standard or sort of across the board test for maybe a skincare ingredient that provides blue light protection or a universal test for effective anti-pollution hair care. Instead, they're co-creating a test that's proprietary to the client's sort of maybe the benefit claims they want to make or the mechanism of action of a particular ingredient they believe they've developed. Do I have this right? And help me think further in this direction.
Yeah, I think it can happen both ways, where sometimes two companies will come together, see that there's an unmet market need, whether that be two separate testing companies or perhaps a brand who has a lot of different things they want to screen for and they know they want to use that model, right? So sometimes you can work together to bring that to market. And then, sometimes that can be commercialized as a group. But we often see it where maybe there's a large ingredient company or a large brand who has a lot of products and they're interested in screening so many molecules um, at once that it's more effective for them to come up with something that is proprietary to them, that will help propel them in the market.
Mhm, mhm. And that's an excellent example, and you mentioned sort of that ingredient development stage earlier. Are there other sort of common cases when a beauty supplier or manufacturer does this sort of testing in terms of maybe that company's strategic priorities?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of hot areas in the market. Anywhere from GLP-1 and skin interactions. We're seeing neurocosmetics be really popular as well. And I think a lot of companies want to create products that meet those new indications and needs of the market. And companies that are investing in developing testing models that they can use to screen their formulations are ultimately the ones that are going to get ahead in the market.
Mhm, mhm. And certainly, companies all along the supply chain are well regarded for their roles as industry innovators. At the same time, these companies, whether they're contract manufacturers, packaging makers, even machinery specialists, they also reflect what the industry at large is doing. And surely that's the same sort of case is true in testing. You mentioned neurocosmetics as sort of a request that you're seeing from customers. I'm wondering if there are other sorts of beauty industry trends or movements that you have noticed being reflected in your client work. Are there other sort of revolutionary ingredients or product benefits we should be watching for?
Yeah, I think, there's always product benefits that are no, emerging, but I think one of the things that comes to mind is that we often see trends cycle. I think a good example of that is currently blue light. This was something that we saw pretty often quite a few years ago, and we had developed a reproducible model for testing that. And then, it kind of died down for a bit. But recently, in the past month, I've seen at least two or three articles in cosmetics and toiletries about blue light testing. So I think that's a good example. I think hormones and metabolism are something that have been a hot topic for a long time. Um, I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the trend towards or the circling back on the trend of holistic beauty, holistic health, beauty from within. Seeing a lot more brands that were originally focused on skin and topical treatments now looking at ingestibles that are meant to be taken in conjunction with topical treatments. And of course, personalization. consumers want personalization to their own individual areas of concern for every product they use.
You mentioned supplements. Can you say anything about the sort of difference or maybe the similarity of this sort of gene expression or protein expression testing when it is a topical product in contrast to an ingestible product like a supplement or
Yeah,
a
yeah, that's
nutritional
a really
supplement,
good
sometime we say.
Yeah, a really good area to think about. I think it's really important when we design those studies, because when you're looking at a topical product, there's 3D skin models where you can apply that topical product. It permeates through the skin, and you can see the direct effects on cells. It can be a bit more complicated with nutritional supplements, especially when they're orally ingested, because obviously they need to be metabolized, broken down by the body. It's not necessarily the raw material that's having the impact, it's the metabolite it's broken down to. So a lot of the times we see the in vitro testing for nutraceuticals is usually a certain cell type treated with some kind of material or metabolite, just as a proof of concept to see is this something that might show promise in humans. But yeah, I think the nutraceuticals align a bit closer with the pharmaceutical industry, actually,
Mhm.
which we work in as well. But it's really cool to see the intersection between the two industries, and even cosmetics and the testing processes are trending towards a more pharma-like structure as well.
Mhm. Mhm. I'm curious, just quickly, is there anything that gene expression testing really can't be used effectively for? Are there certain benefit claims or efficacy, even mechanisms of action that this just doesn't make sense for some reason? Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, that's an important question. I think a lot of folks do come to us and, they ask, can we use this gene expression data in marketing or in our claim substantiation?
Mm.
And it's important to note that we're not the experts on the regulatory part of this. There's absolutely instances where this data can be used to strengthen marketing claims. You can correlate it with clinical results that you see. You can help to explain the mechanism of action, but ultimately, you do need to have some kind of clinical testing performed. And of course, always need to work with a regulatory expert to make sure that this information is communicated properly, especially within different markets, because of course, there's different regulations depending on where you're marketing to.
Yeah, yeah, no, it just sounds to me like this is most useful really in terms of understanding, right? And sort of the ingredient or product development part of the work. And since we're always thinking in a future forward direction, I do want to ask you before we finish up, how do you think AI models will impact the world of testing? Does that sort of predictive digital technology mean that we don't need as much in-lab testing to happen?
Yeah, no, I like that you bring that question up. There was a conference I went to recently where there was a panel discussion, and this exact question came up where it says, can AI replace the kind of physical, in vitro or in vivo testing in the future? And I think the AI tools will be very helpful for figuring out which ingredients to use, what ratios and blends, will they have promising effects, good at predicting that. But ultimately, that physical testing does still need to take place. It's really important to verify what the computers are telling us, right? If you don't just want to copy and paste what AI says, you want to prove, you would read it first. You would prove and make sure that it works. So I think at a certain point, it'll be a tool in the process of designing studies and designing what to test and maybe prioritizing those things. But this kind of testing will still need to take place.
Yeah, no, that makes very good sense, Jocelyn. This was all so very interesting. I thank you for sharing your knowledge and your time with us here on Cosmo Factory.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you find the Cosmo Factory podcast useful, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star review and share your thoughts so even more cosmetic industry professionals can discover the Cosmo Factory. I'm Deanna Utrusky. Please join me again next Tuesday for a new episode of the Cosmo Factory podcast.